I'm Nella Canales from ODI, and I found that the project about tea and coffee really interesting. I was wondering, because you were also talking about cross-sectoral coordination, if you have considered what is the impact of these national targets around expanding tea and coffee plantation areas? How does this affect forest areas in Rwanda? And if there has been any, if it does, if there has been any measure taken around how to, reconciliate those, what seems to be two different kind of targets in terms of the country development, especially when you talk about the long-term perspective, because I think that the ultimate objective is trying to make livelihoods around forest a sustainable way of living. And probably the first, the first step would be to liaise with some kind of more value chain, that you have a crop that you can actually, a cash crop that you can live with. But ultimately it's also to try to make forest also an attractive livelihood. So that's my first question. And quickly to the second one, and this is for Nerwa. What is going to happen after the DFID grant? Is there any plan? Are you considering funding it significantly through national budgets sources? Thank you.
Thanks. Do you want to start, Paul?
Yes. Okay. You've highlighted upon an interesting point, and that's that when we're doing this mainstreaming, we're adding a climate change slice on top of an existing program. It's not really our remit to question the underlying program and fundamentally change the government's existing policy. But I think we're lucky in Rwanda because there is an integrated policy, and certainly some of the additional and new considerations on some of the work that they're doing is trying to integrate, tea considerations with watershed management, with forestries. But one of the issues is we come to this quite often from our on adaptation with quite a lot of baggage, and people do try and use adaptation as a means to change underlying objectives and issues, and I think it's a interesting point that I have no answer for, but it's just an observation that tends to happen, and I think as we go to mainstreaming there is this sort of conflict between the degree to which you can use adaptation as the leveraging force to try and do development better. I think, and I'll hand over to Alex, because Alex will probably say something about the FINERA question, and we can let others come in. But
Alex, you address
okay,
the question?
Thanks. Yeah, just maybe before I jump into the FINERA question, as Paul said, some of the things we are piloting is how do forestry lands become better managed in coordination with the tea estates. Some of the adaptation benefits we are talking about in looking at the future climate impacts is to ensure that the tea goes to upper highlands, and I think he mentioned about the value addition even to the tea, but the adaptation benefit is even soil stabilization on some of these lands. To get away from soil erosion, soil losses. So that is how we are looking at it, and pretty much we are looking at the large scale landscape restoration, and it's not just forests. Even tea as a crop and coffee as a crop provide some of these benefits of large scale restoration programs that we are looking at in Rwanda beyond just trees themselves. Coming back to the funding, one of the things that perhaps didn't come out clear is we perceive this, and it was conceived as a national fund. So there is government contribution, government funding. There are different streams of funds, forestry funds, water resource, water and other natural resources, such as even mining. They contribute to the fund in terms of fines and fees, environmental fines and fees as well. So there's a government financial streams that actually capitalize this fund. And they are significant and they are likely to grow in terms of payment for ecosystem services. That's something that's being discussed at this point. But this being a fund is the business of mobilizing resources. We all know in this room, as well as your room, that there is a significant climate finance out there. What has been difficult is how it flows to countries, to developing countries specifically. There are things like climate investment funds, which fortunately we have been able as a country to submit an expression of interest to become a pilot, in the second phase of the pilot program for climate resilience, for forestry investment plans, for scaling up renewable energy, and those are all opportunities to be able to mobilize resources at the scale that can then be able to be put to use through the fund itself. These initiatives I've been talking about have come in the time that the fund has been in existence, which certainly talks a whole lot about the benefits of a national fund for climate change in terms of leveraging resources to do exactly that, to address climate impacts. Just in the initial stages, just to give you an example, before we even became capitalized by DFID, we were able, because of the technical expertise and the focus that the fund has as its mandate to mobilize resources, we were able to attract $10 million in the adaptation fund. We have accessed the Global Environmental Facility through African Development Bank. So the short answer to your question about looking beyond DFID, and I believe we are not yet setting our sights beyond DFID. They are still in the business. They like what they have contributed to. So I believe we are not yet there in terms of looking beyond, but there are some other opportunities. They have been a critical catalyst for even other bilaterals. I talked of the Germans, and I am talking of the Swedish, who we are talking about mobilizing resources, and many other opportunities that the fund is well positioned to attract.
Thank you. And before I let you rest, I've got a question from online that I'd like to put to you as well. So this comes from John Marsham at the University of Leeds, who is the lead scientist on our Future Climate for Africa project that covers Rwanda. And he asks, you've already told us what sort of current climate information you're using and that you need, but can you give John a wish list for what future climate information you would like the programme to be producing for you?
Absolutely. We have a critical need. One of the things we have started with through Paul's work is kind of consolidating the existing climate information from different sectors, from the Ministry of Disaster Management, from the Meteo Rwanda, from Rwanda Environment Management Authority. So we are in the process of consolidating information that is available, and then we'll be able to identify gaps. This information is being posted on the website of the fund itself to make it accessible. But it is also mostly focused on how do we identify gaps. For instance, things to do with the weather prediction is still a critical need for us, which of course impacts agriculture. Smallholder farmers need this information to be able to inform irrigation investments, for instance. So the broader information is around weather simulations, being able to understand when will the rains come next, how are we likely to warm up in terms of global warming, how does it specifically affect not only Rwanda broadly, but even specific regions in Rwanda. Just to give you an example, the northern part of the country is reputed to be the coldest part of the country, but of recent, and it used to be devoid of mosquitoes that cause malaria. Of recent, there has been some cases of malaria, which speaks about the fact that the region is warming unusually. So how do we predict in terms of ensuring preparedness? One other critical thing is of recent, in the last 2 weeks, Rwanda has faced serious issues with the flooding, which have repercussions that are cost intensive. And the question is the intensity of rains. Where are they going to happen? How can we prepare for that? The future climate predictions in terms of variability that we anticipate to see. Hard science that could be well beyond the capacity of Rwanda. We need to tap into even existing systems around the world to be able to consolidate that information, to be able to predict how the future unfolds for us. So I think maybe I should say stay tuned. Right now we are in the consolidation phase of, and we will be able to identify gaps that then we'll be able to address through future climate for Africa.
Thank you. Any other questions in the room? You sit in the front.
Thank you. My name is Peter Baker from Neumann Stiftung and Climate Edge. I was very happy to hear you, Paul, talk about the great amount of uncertainty and then the fact that actually a lot of the time we're just guessing. But then you say, for instance, with coffee, we must plant more shade. I mean, how do you know that more shade is going to work?
So, you know, you've hit upon an issue that's there in that, on the one hand, we say there's uncertainty, but we still have to make decisions, and we have to look at how to make our investments in a climate of decision-making under uncertainty, which is something that we do anyway, but it's always quite challenging. And I think that the way that we've tried to approach it is by first of all, looking to see which of the priority areas where we know there's going to be problems. So we can look across the country of Rwanda and we can see where the hotter areas are. And the climate data tells us from the observational data where it's the rate of change that we've experienced in the past, and we can at least get some feel for which areas are going to be hit first and prioritize those as options for shade. And the thing for shade is that there is a little bit of extra complexity here. It does depend on some variables, but we're really doing it because in cases where you have low input coffee production, shade just actually helps improve the quality of production today. So you get an immediate economic benefit, and so it sort of does no harm. And at the same time, we also know that in the areas where we're probably going to plant, those are the ones that will reach the sort of thresholds that we expect to see the quickest. So there are certain temperature thresholds that we know are bad for coffee, so that's where we might prioritise those first. So we're trying to work in a framework of decision making under uncertainty, but it's this is the challenge.
You've got field data from Rwanda on that.
Well, could you maybe, sounds like you've got a detailed conversation with lots of other questions, so maybe you could pick
let's
it up.
please have a chat.
Can I take a round of three, as I know there are a lot of people
Nicola,
wanted to...
ask a
Oh,
question
sorry.
as well?
Oh, you want to ask a question?
Ask a question, if I may,
Okay.
use my position. I wanted to ask Paul and maybe others, where you think it's best to be embedding capacity to use and interpret climate information for decision-making around investment decision-making, because it sounds like, well, you guys know what you're doing, and we can get into the details as to how you what kind of information you use and how you are sort of dealing with uncertainty. But what about technical people in the agriculture ministry? What about FONAWA? What about the finance ministry, if they're going to be funding in the future, or looking at ways of sort of integrating adaptation into investment decisions? Like, where would you see the best place to focus that sort of capacity building?
Yes, I mean that's again, it's a shame the questions are so difficult. But the key thing here, I think, is that you have an existing institutional landscape about who is involved in climate information today, and you have to definitely respect that. There obviously is the remit with Rwanda Meteo, and who are the obvious people who collect the data, and then in each of the relevant ministries you might have an agri-met department, for example. And so I think one issue is you've got to work with the expertise and the relevant levels of information. So, you know, if you're looking at anything that's involved with, you know, current weather forecasting or even short-term climate services, then there's an obvious need for the TA to go into Rwanda Meteo, and Fonero is investing in Rwanda Meteo with a project. But at the same time, it's about the use of that information in applications. And I think that's when the technical assistance shifts in going from Rwanda Meteo alone to what might be particularly a boundary organisation role in trying to help other ministries use that information in decision making. And I think that's something that we've long argued for, is that in the same way that you can, you know, if you're in the UK, there's, I always get my UK SIP and my UKIPs muddled up, which I know is very bad. UK SIP is a very good boundary organisation that helps others use climate information. And I have strongly advocated that you might need something to support you know, sector ministries use climate information, and that might best be provided through some sort of boundary organisation rather than trying to replicate in each individual ministry. So I think there's that's my kind of instinct, but I'm not aware of anyone who's tested it yet.
Thank you. Okay, now I'll take 3 questions. Lindsay first.
Hi, Lindsay Jones with ODI as well. We heard about a brilliant example here of how climate information is being used in Rwanda, a country where Sophie mentioned has probably benefited, you know, one of the primary drivers of that is because they have such buy-in from the top all the way up to Paul Kagame. I just have a question, perhaps for Sophie and for Paul. Sorry, Paul. But how can we kind of replicate this, or can this be replicated in the use of climate information, particularly medium to long-term climate information, in countries where they don't have such strong buy-in from the top, with an African perspective, perhaps?
Okay, I'll take 2 more before we answer.
Hi, my name is Andrew Sudmont. I'm a research fellow at the Climate Smart Cities program at Leeds. There's been some discussion of the Green Climate Fund and different sources of funding for FNERWA. I'm wondering, given the scale of the required finance for some of these plans, if there's a need for private finance, and if that's the case, what some of the opportunities and barriers are. Thank you.
Okay, and I'll take one of the ladies over here.
Hi, I'm Sarah Cobley from Adam Smith International. I just wanted to ask on a more sort of concrete level about the various value chains that are sort of feasible for working in. Paul talked about the work that he did in tea and coffee, and Sarah also mentioned briefly that Access to Finance Rwanda has been looking at tea and coffee. But are there any other sectors or value chains that are sort of ripe for a climate mainstreaming approach, and if so, what are they, and what would be the main challenges in sort of adapting the 3 action points to the other sectors?
Okay, thank you. So in your answers, could you be concise so we can try and squeeze in another round? But maybe, Paul, would you like to start, and then we'll go to Alex after?
Okay, yeah, Lindsay, good question. Can you do this elsewhere? And I do try and do it in other countries as well, and certainly it is easier in Rwanda than other places. And I think the greater the institutional and governance challenges, the more difficult it becomes. And sometimes the modality has to change as a result of that with the partners that you work with. And I think the thing that could change it is the attraction of large-scale climate finance, in the same way that raising this in the Ministry of Finance has made it a bigger issue in Rwanda. As GCF scales up and people realise that it's a big issue, I think you might see other countries put greater attention to it as an opportunity, more than perhaps so much on the risk side.
Alex or Sarah, are you able to address the second question? Sorry?
Okay. I'll just go by the way I understand it. The way I understand it is we are talking of opportunities from GCF. How about private financing opportunities? Just apologize when I was introducing FNERWA, didn't mention the fact that we target private sector, NGOs, and public institutions in terms of access to the fund. But much more specifically, for the private sector, we have two instruments. One is the innovation grant that seeks to catalyze investments in sustainable activities. And within that, there is 25% equity as a requirement, which is intent on leveraging private sector resources into the fund. In terms of the line of credit, we are partnering, we process, and due diligence is carried out by Rwanda Development Bank, which then has a contribution of 30% of their own money invested in this kind of activities. We believe that's a humble start into how we intend to structure the fund even going forward to become a principal vehicle for investments from the private sector within the scope of environment and climate change. More specifically, in terms of GCF, we have actually been able to request for funding beyond the ceiling of 50 million for which we were accredited. And part of the reason is because of the opportunities we see around the pilot we want to do with the significant investment from private sector. So private sector financing in the space of climate change is very much at the heart of FONERWA, and we believe going forward, it's going to be a significant component of the capitalization and financing of FONERWA, including the payment for ecosystem services we are talking about.
I think just to complement that, I mean, I think FONERWA at the moment is a very broad fund, so it covers, provides support from sort of district level adaptation programs right up to sort of fairly large scale renewable energy programs. And obviously the need for private finance and the engagement and role of the private sector will vary depending on the nature of the project. But, you know, certainly there is a need for private finance in Rwanda. I mean, you know, public finance is not going to deliver, you know, everything that Rwanda needs. And, you know, there's a big push in Rwanda on, you know, bringing private finance into the country. And I think the government sees this as a, you know, a real opportunity to sort of put Rwanda on the map as far as green growth is concerned, and sort of trying to attract, you know, green sort of investments in Rwanda. And yeah, and obviously there'll be a need for sort of private finance providers as well to support that. So I think, you know, that it's still early days for FONERWA, and I think, you know, this is one area of the fund which needs a bit more thought and sort of emphasis, I think, going forward in the strategic approach. But yeah, definitely something that is of interest here.
Value chains.
Yeah, so we've been working on, rather some of my colleagues have, on value, sort of climate resilient value chain analysis through a number of different projects. Braced is one. There's another program called PRIZE, Pathways to Resilience in Semi-Arid Economies. I think through both of those are a number of interesting studies looking at along the value chain, at points where there may be particular vulnerabilities to both current climate variability and longer-term climate change. And I think those look across a number of different sectors. There's one very interesting study on the shear value chain in Burkina Faso, which I would suggest you look at, which looks at the kind of the development benefits of growing shear trees, but also as the shear as a commodity, as a sort of climate resilient commodity as well. And then there are a number of studies that have been done under PRIZE looking at livestock markets and the cotton value chains. And I think they're both quite different. The livestock one is looking at the sort of horizontal integration across markets and where some of the sort of problems might be when there's drought, particularly in the Sahel. And I think, you know, what all of these sort of studies point to is that there can be kind of incentives, particularly from the top, to make the value chains more integrated and more kind of climate resilient. But I think what's sort of lacking at the moment is the the links with the public sector and what we've been talking about more today, really. So the sort of the support to overcoming some of those gaps or sort of problems in value chain. So I think there sort of seem to be two separate discussions going on at the moment, and it'd be good to see them more kind of joined up. But I think certainly the sort of analysis that Paul's been doing would be useful to add to these studies.
The iPad of doom is telling me that I have to start wrapping up. But if I go with this clock, it tells me I have 1 more minute rather than that one. So has someone got a burning question that will help wrap everything up? Sarah at the front.
Thank you very much. I'm Stamon from University of Sussex. My question is for Emily. Thank you for bringing the challenges that are around, local government financing. But can you think? Do you think we can move beyond just workshops? At local level. Do you see any additional entry points that you can look at in a maybe developing country setting? Thank you.
Yeah, I hope we have moved beyond workshops. Yeah, I mean, I think in response to that, I think that probably the sort of technical assistance analysis work that's being done at the national level can also be done at the local level as well, and particularly where there is going to be local funds in place to receive adaptation climate finance. So, I mean, I think, the two things have to go hand in hand. If there's funding available, then working with local governments to build up the kind of technical capacity expertise to be able to use climate information and give local development projects that sort of added value over these different time scales, and the way that that Paul was talking about would be a really nice approach. I think we need to be working on both of those issues.
Thank you. Well, just to wrap up, thank you again to Paul for presenting the work and for doing the work so well, and also to Emily and to our colleagues in Rwanda. Thank you so much for joining us. It's been great to see you and have you here with us today, and thank you to the audience as well and to ODI for hosting us. Thanks very much.